Well, good day, everyone, and thanks for watching. So my name is Patrick Wagner. I'm the entomology field specialist based out in Rapid City, South Dakota. In this webinar, I'm going to be talking about blister beetles and how they can kind of impact alfalfa production in South Dakota. So this insect, I get a lot of questions about these, it seems like, throughout the year. A lot of people, they either don't know what they are, or maybe they've heard about them, but they don't really know what they look like or a lot about them. So for this webinar, I'm going to go over some of those details and hopefully answer some of those questions that people often have about blister beetles. So kind of what you need to know on blister beetles. So just starting out here with an outline, what I'm going to talk about today. We'll start out just an overview of blister beetles kind of in general, what they are and kind of the defining characteristics and stuff. And then we'll go into talking about why they're an issue in South Dakota and really kind of across the country, how they can cause problems for alfalfa production. I'll show some examples on some of the common species that we have in South Dakota and just how to identify those pretty quickly. And then I'll talk about when the best time to scout for blister beetles is, kind of when you need to start doing that, and then also how you can go about scouting for them. And then we'll finish off with just some management options if you do have a blister beetle infestation, or how to avoid that, and kind of how to handle that kind of situation. So starting with kind of, what are blister beetles? Well, they're in the family Meloidae. And then in this family, you have a lot of these blister beetles, and they're found, all across the world and across North America as well. So one of the questions I often get is, are these an invasive species? Well, no, that's not the case. They're not an invasive insect. We have a lot of native species right here in South Dakota. And it's been noted that the greatest diversity for these beetles is more in arid or semi-arid regions. So more of like the southwestern United States, you get a lot more diversity. So in general, blister beetles are kind of a medium to large sized insect. Most of them are under an inch long, but they're kind of around that inch range. They can kind of vary in coloration, really depends on the species, and I'll show examples of that later on. One thing about these, they kind of have a velvety appearance to them. They have a lot of really small hairs that kind of cover their body, and you can kind of see it in this picture here that they kind of do almost look velvety. So a couple of the more unique characteristics of blister beetles is the first thing is the thorax there, that middle segment. You can see it's a little bit narrower there than the head as well as the abdomen. And then the other thing is that the abdomen there, the tip of it will stick out past the elytra, and the elytra is just a name for those hardened forewings on the back. So a little bit about their feeding habits. So the adults are herbivores. They'll feed on pollen, flowers, and leaves. So I know this, it's not, this talk is focused on alfalfa, but with these blister beetles, some of them can be a bit of a pest of gardens because they'll cause that defoliation. It's really not a concern for alfalfa fields, though, to have that defoliation. It's not bad enough to really warrant any type of management that way for these beetles. But if you have a garden, maybe you'd watch out. The larvae, on the other hand, they're a little bit different. They're predatory, and they're going to be active underground. So in the soil, they're going to be mostly feeding on grasshopper eggs, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on as well. There's only one generation of blister beetles per year. So yeah, what shows up initially, that's what's going to be there for the rest of the year. So just talking about the life cycle here, for blister beetles, they're going to overwinter as what we call a pseudo-pupae, which that pseudo is basically like a pre-pupa. The pupal form is kind of that transitional stage between a larva and an adult. So they're in that pseudo-pupa for the winter, and then when it starts to warm up there in the spring, they're going to finish that pupation process, and then they're going to emerge as adults. And that happens during the summer, mostly in June and into July. Kind of depends on the species, or how quickly it warms up, depending on the year. And then those adults are going to be active for the rest of the summer. It does depend on the species. Some of them are only around for maybe a month. Some of them are there for the duration of the summer. It just kind of depends that way. And at the end of the season there, they're going to be laying their eggs. That usually happens in late summer or early fall. They're going to be laying egg clusters in the soil. And as I mentioned before, then those larvae, they're going to be feeding on grasshopper eggs. Okay, so why are they an issue? Because I said, yeah, they feed on grasshopper eggs, so that's good, right? I mean, it is to a point, but there are some, a specific problem that we run into with these beetles. So they're actually toxic. For the adults there, their blood contains cantharidin, and that is a toxic chemical that can cause blistering on the skin when you come in contact with them. So you can see in this picture here, this is a wrist of one of my colleagues that got nailed by one of these things. So got a little bit of that cantharidin on his skin, and then you can see that blister forming. So cantharidin, it's released through what we call reactive or reflex bleeding. It's that chemical is used as defense. So if they feel threatened, they can release that chemical, and then those potential predators or whatever's bothering will leave them alone. So I wanted to mention, if you're trying to pick one of these things up, definitely don't use your bare hands. You need to wear gloves because you don't want to handle those insects and then get some of that cantharidin on your skin. So moving on, so yes, they can release that cantharidin, through that reactive bleeding, but it can also be released if those beetles are crushed. So that's where we run into problems here if they end up getting baled into, an alfalfa bale. So contaminated alfalfa, it can actually be fatal to livestock. That cantharidin can cause basically internal blistering, and it can make those animals sick. This happens either, one of two ways. One being if the beetles are crushed and then that cantharidin ends up coating that hay, or even if the beetles aren't crushed and you have, whole beetles that are baled up with that alfalfa, they can still contain that cantharidin. Even after they're dead, that chemical will still be viable inside them. So then when the animals go to eat the hay, then they'll be chewing and they'll be breaking up those beetles that way. So for cattle and sheep, that kind of thing, they can, it would more make them sick. It might not kill the animals, but if they eat enough of them, it definitely could. Horses are really the main concern because they're very sensitive to cantharidin. So it really doesn't take nearly as many beetles for those horses to get sick and die. So I wanted to show this. If maybe some of you would be familiar with these things showing up in the news. This was earlier this year. You can kind of see the dates there. It's in January. I think this kind of happened over the winter there in 2019. But basically, I just did a Google search there for blister beetle in Wisconsin, and you see all these news stories that pop up. And this particular incident, it kind of made national headlines there, pretty much all over the country, you know, the Chicago Tribune there, New York, all over the place. And it was an incident that happened in Wisconsin with some infested hay. So this was a horse ranch. This couple purchased some alfalfa bales online. It was an online auction site that was based in South Dakota. There's been kind of some, you know, back and forth of if the hay actually came from South Dakota or Wyoming. That was like the initial claim. But then, you know, then they kind of did some investigating that maybe it didn't originate from South Dakota. It was from maybe Texas or in the South. So they're not really sure where the hay came from. But anyway, they ended up feeding that hay to the horses. A lot of those horses became sick, and then several of them died. I've heard, you know, there was reports of like 13 horses or 14 or 15. But either way, yeah, several of them ended up dying from those, from that hay. And then, you know, they had the veterinarian look at them, and, you know, the veterinarian identified, you know, they saw blistering and holes and stuff that was in the esophagus, in the stomach and the intestines of those animals. And then they checked the hay bales and they found blister beetles present in the hay. So I guess if you're interested, this couple, I don't know if there was any actual legal action or a lawsuit that came out of this, but I know they did launch a GoFundMe campaign. They're requesting $50,000. Last I checked, I think they were up to almost 40,000. But it's just more of something to help them cover the costs of, you know, getting that infested hay, losing money on that, and then obviously the death of their animals. So kind of interesting that way. So getting more into the toxicity, or, you know, we know that the beetles contain cantharidin, but how much does it really take to kill an animal or to make them sick? So there's been studies on this. The estimated lethal concentration here of cantharidin is about 1 milligram per 2.2 pounds. And that's estimated for horses. And to put that into perspective, you know, it's anywhere from 1 to 5 milligrams of cantharidin can be present per blister beetle adult. And then I wanted to mention that we'll talk about some of those species here coming up, but the striped and the Ashgray, those are two different types of blister beetles here. They have the highest concentrations, at least here in South Dakota. Then the striped beetle, they average about 5 milligrams of cantharidin per beetle, and then the Ashgray is about 1 milligram. All the other beetles, it really kind of drops off from that 1 milligram, so quite a bit less concentration that way. So this table here, you know, it kind of shows an example there for horses. So this is the estimated number of beetles required to cause mortality by horse weight. So kind of we have on the top there, the different weight there of maybe a small horse. And then on the left there, we have some of the different beetles that were looked at in this study. So for, say, a 500-pound horse, for black blister beetles, you'd need quite a few of these to cause mortality. So, you know, 1,100 there in this case. The spotted blister beetle, I'm not going to talk about this one later because it's not as common in South Dakota. I know they have it in Montana, so it's probably here, but we don't really see them very often. But in this case, you know, the spotted blister beetle, it's quite a bit less. You only need about 345 of those to cause mortality there. And then we look at the striped blister beetle, and it's much less. You'd only need 80 of these beetles to cause mortality. So you can see that pretty big difference there between like the black blister beetles and the striped in terms of how toxic they are. Okay, so these are just some of the common species that we have in South Dakota. We have the black blister beetle, the Ashgray, the Immaculate blister beetle, the striped blister beetle, and then the margin blister beetle. And I'm going to go over each one of these just individually. I'll show a picture and just kind of a very brief description, kind of to get an idea on how to identify these if you see them out in the field. So starting with the black blister beetle, these are a little bit smaller. They're only about 2/5 to 2/3 of an inch long. And as you can see in the picture there, they're entirely black, from head to toe there. And, I did mention that these have more of a velvety appearance in general for blister beetles. But from what I've seen, some of these black ones, I think just because of their coloration, they almost appear a little bit shinier than some of those other beetles. Mostly they're just kind of dull, that dull velvety appearance, but with the black blister beetles, they might shimmer a little bit. Next is the Ashgray blister beetle. So these, again, about the same size there as the black, 2/5 to 2/3 of an inch long. And then, as you can see there, coloration, just as the name implies there, they're kind of a light gray, and then they'll have some black markings on them as well, like this one here, just some black markings here and there with the antenna, and then some on the legs. But in general, they're going to be that light gray color. So next is the Immaculate blister beetle. This is probably one of the largest here in South Dakota. They're anywhere from 1/2 to 1 inch long. And the whole body will be either this orange color, as you can see in the picture there, or they can be kind of a gray color as well. So there's a little bit of a variation within this species in terms of color, differentiating these from the Ashgray. Just, kind of an easy way is that these Immaculate beetles are quite a bit bigger, more around that inch size when they're fully grown. So next is the striped blister beetle. So these are, again, those real toxic ones. So this is anywhere from 2/5 to 2/3 of an inch. So again, a little bit smaller than those Immaculate blister beetles. But these are going to be black and either yellow or orange color. They'll have those stripes on them. In terms of the markings there, you can kind of see in the picture, they'll have 2 triangular markings on the head, kind of like those 2 triangles pointing away from each other there on the back of the head. They'll have 2 black stripes on the thorax, and then they'll have anywhere from 2 to 3 black stripes there on the elytra, again on the back there on the hardened forewings. And then the last one that I'll talk about here is the margins blister beetle. So again, kind of similar size with these, 2/5 to 2/3 of an inch long. These come in several forms. So you can have ones that are mostly gray, mostly black, or then you'll have the ones that are black with the white margins there on the sides that you can see here, an example of that in this picture. That's where they get their name, the margin blister beetle. They'll have the margins. And then their head will be black and white. And I wanted to mention that these are noted for having pretty severe defoliation potential. So more of an issue, again, for if you're gardening, that these things, if they show up, they can really defoliate some of your plants pretty heavily. Maybe not something to worry about with your alfalfa, but at least if you have a garden, you don't want these things showing up. Okay, so moving on, we'll talk about when to scout for blister beetles. So first things first, you want to always check the fields for blister beetles prior to each alfalfa cutting. That's just, good practice. You want to go out, check the fields and make sure whether they're there or not, and kind of what kinds are there. We'll talk about that here in the next slide. But in general, you'd want to check the second and later cuttings. That's more important because they're going to have a higher risk of infestation. In general, you're going to want to check all of the cuttings, but those later cuttings, there's going to be more blister beetles because that's when those adults will emerge a little bit later there into June and July. So you might have depending on what part of the state you're in and how much rain you've gotten in the spring, you might probably already have that first cutting out by the time these blister beetles show up. So very important to check the second and later cuttings. And I also wanted to mention that the blister beetle populations are often higher where you had large grasshopper populations the year before. Because those larvae are going to feed on grasshopper eggs, those are going to be the same sites where those blister beetles will be laying their eggs, is where the grasshoppers lay their eggs. So, I mean, grasshoppers like kind of that patchier grass and bare ground and stuff. Those kinds of areas will probably be have a pretty high level of blister beetles there as well. So be sure to, double check there for blister beetles if you had a lot of grasshoppers last year. So how to scout for blister beetles? Well, this is just really through the visual observations. You can go out into the field and just check individual plants and look for them that way. I recommend using a sweep net. They're really useful because you can oftentimes catch insects that you otherwise wouldn't think are out there. Just shown in the picture here, kind of how to do that. You're just walking forward as you're sweeping that net back and forth in front of you, and then just check the inside of that net, and you'll be able to see if there's any blister beetles that are there. So there's no established thresholds for blister beetles. The main thing that you want to be looking for is what species are present. So that's kind of that difference of if there's black blister beetles there, maybe that's not such a big deal, but if you're seeing a lot of striped blister beetles, that would probably cause a little bit more concern because they're a lot more toxic. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that you want to check different areas of the field. So we've noticed kind of more of an edge effect with blister beetles. So there might be higher concentrations in the field edges. You sweep through that and you get a bunch of them, but then you go into the middle of the field and you might not catch any. So there is kind of a difference there, but definitely worth checking when you're scouting the field. So in terms of management, you want to harvest alfalfa prior to peak bloom. That's kind of ideal to reduce the number of blister beetles that might show up. So as I mentioned, the adults are herbivores and they really like flowers and they're highly attracted to pollen. So if you can kind of reduce the flowering in that field, harvesting in the bud stage to try to at least minimize some of that flowering, you might not have as many beetles getting into the field to begin with. So if you go out there and you see a lot of blister beetles, you have an infested field, when you go to cut that hay, you're going to make sure you do it without using a conditioner. You don't want to crimp or crush the hay. That was the reason that I mentioned earlier, that you don't want to be smashing those beetles because they'll end up having that cantharidin coating the hay. So definitely something you want to avoid. The other thing is, after you've cut the hay, you want to make sure that you allow it to dry fully before you rake it up. That'll give time for those beetles to leave the plants. I mean, they're not going to hang out on plants that are drying up and everything, because that you kind of eliminated their food source. So you want to give them time to kind of vacate those windrows and stuff before you go and rake it up. And then the other thing that's probably most important here is you don't want to spray the fields with an insecticide. Yes, it's going to kill the beetles, but it can kind of backfire on you because you're going to end up with a lot of dead beetles in the hay. So then when you cut it, you're not going to have those beetles leaving the hay. They're all just going to stay there because they're dead. So that could actually increase the number of beetles that you end up having per bale. And even if they're dead, like I said, they'll still have that cantharidin in them, and that chemical is viable and can still cause problems. So some considerations here for buying or selling hay. You definitely want to avoid situations like what happened in Wisconsin. First things first, you want, if you have infested hay, you want to notify the buyer or a potential buyer there if any bales are infested, or just sell the ones that aren't infested. One thing, if you're using the hay for horses, you should probably try and use the first cutting for them if possible. Try to feed that because it's going to have obviously lower numbers of blister beetles than that of the second and later cuttings. And then the other thing, we want to try to avoid feeding the hay from field edges, especially to horses, because again, like I talked with that edge effect, you're going to have more blister beetles probably in that section of the field than you would towards the center. So just to summarize here, overall, we started off talking about blister beetles, and just want you to know that they can be toxic to livestock because they contain that chemical cantharidin. We talked about scouting the fields, and make sure you do that prior to each cutting. You want to know what species are present. And just keep in mind that we do have that striped and ashgray that are a bit more toxic than some of those other blister beetle species. So just be aware of that. When you are cutting, make sure you cut early, and then also allow that alfalfa to dry fully before you rake it up. And then finally, always just be careful when you're buying or selling infested hay, that you don't want to be, make sure that the buyer knows what they're getting, and make sure that, that it's not going to horses or something that's going to be, cause problems down the road. So with that, I thank you for your time today. Here's my contact information. If you have questions, feel free to call the Rapid City Regional Center. This is my email address here. And then you can also, mail me samples, or feel free to stop by if you have questions as well. So that's all I have. Thank you.